Welcome back. Today I'd like to explain how it's possible to lose a language that has been written for thousands of years by the greatest power in the world. The answer lies in Egypt's long and unique history. I can remember when America celebrated its bicentennial in 1976. 200 years, and we went crazy. Egypt lasted for 3,000. It's difficult to imagine a civilization lasting that long. The history is so long that Egyptologists divide it into segments that are more manageable to conceive. Let's look at them. The prehistoric period includes everything before writing. Prehistoric doesn't refer to a particular date in the history of the world. It refers to a civilization's time before it wrote down its history. It's a relative term. Egypt started writing down its history around 3100 BC with the Norma palette. Everything before that is prehistoric. So while Egypt is in the historic period around 3100 BC, all of Europe was still prehistoric and would be for thousands of years to come. The Old Kingdom follows the prehistoric period. It's around 3100 BC to 2181 BC. The first date is just an approximation, but the important thing is that this is the beginning of Egypt's greatness as a nation. Although this is the beginning of Egypt's historic period, this is when Egypt pulls off some of its greatest achievements. Indeed, this is when Egypt builds the pyramids. Many people think that the pyramids were the culmination of this great civilization. But no, they came right at the beginning. Still, they didn't come quickly. It took 2 centuries to get them right. It started with a king named Zoser, who built the first pyramid ever, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. That was a development that didn't happen overnight. Previously, pharaohs and nobles had been buried under mud brick mastabas, Arabic for bench, so named because of their shape. They look like benches. Then Zoser's architect, Imhotep, got the great idea to build a mastaba for the pharaoh out of stone, not mud bricks. So he created the first stone building in the world. But when it was completed, Zoser was alive and well. So Imhotep decided to place a smaller mastaba on top of the first, and then he kept going, as long as Zoser was alive. And that's how we get the Step Pyramid of Zoser. For the next 2 centuries, as long as America's been a country, Egypt was caught up in pyramid mania, building larger and larger, more and more elaborate pyramids, culminating with the Great Pyramid of Giza, the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. It's huge. Its base covers 13.5 acres. It's made out of about 2 million blocks of stone, averaging 2.5 tons each. And it's all done with remarkable precision. For example, one corner to the other, the elevation is level to within 1/4 of an inch. The inside is a maze of rooms and passageways, also requiring great precision. To create something like this, you need writing. Zahi Hawass, the former Egyptian Minister of State for Antiquities Affairs, used to say, Egypt didn't build the pyramids built Egypt. What he meant was that to build something as complicated and large as the Great Pyramid of Giza, you needed mathematics, architecture, the coordination of thousands of workers. All these skills had to be developed for the construction of the pyramids of Egypt. The pyramids weren't the only amazing achievements during the Old Kingdom. Some of the greatest masterpieces of art come from this early period of Egypt's history. The fabulous pair statues of Ra-Hotep and Nofret, son and daughter-in-law of the pharaoh Khufu, or the statue of the Khephren with the falcon protecting him from behind. These are masterpieces of art by any standard, and they come at the beginning of Egypt's recorded history. So for 5 centuries, Egypt is doing great, building pyramids, creating fantastic art, and then the music stops. There is a governmental collapse. We're not sure why. One theory is that the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom may have lived too long. Pepi II is the longest reigning monarch in the history of the world. He may have ruled for as long as 94 years. He took the throne when he was just a kid, but still, that's an amazing reign. The theory is that he became too old to rule, to control the country, and the governors of various districts, or nomes, vied with each other for power, and the centralized government collapsed. So for more than 100 years, we have a period of decentralized power, and Egypt goes downhill. We call this period the First Intermediate Period. It's from around 2181 BC to 2040 BC, because it comes between stable periods. It's intermediate. But don't be sad, Egypt will rise again and be great, and this begins in the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom lasted from about 2040 BC to 1782 BC. Here we once again get a strong central government focused around the pharaoh. We get masterpieces of art, like this head of Sesostris. Look at it closely. It's uniquely Middle Kingdom. Only then are the kings shown as human. He's tired, weary from the responsibilities of leading a great nation. It's a wonderful portrait. It's not idealized. But life is good for around 400 years during the Middle Kingdom. But at the end, we get another collapse. This time because of an invasion by a people called the Hyksos. How could anyone conquer mighty Egypt? The answer may be superior weapons. The Hyksos had the horse and chariot, and the Egyptians didn't. So for more than 100 years, the Hyksos rule Egypt. And this is the Second Intermediate Period, about 1782 BC to 1570 BC. But Egypt rises again. A mighty ruler expels the Hyksos, and once again, we have an Egyptian pharaoh on the throne. This begins the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom runs from about 1570 BC to 1069 BC. This is when we get some of the greatest and most famous pharaohs. This is when Queen Hatshepsut took the throne and ruled as king. She didn't hide the fact that she was a woman. She took the title king and ruled as a pharaoh, not a queen. This is also the period when Akhenaten briefly changed the religion of Egypt to monotheism and almost destroyed the country. During the New Kingdom, we get Akhenaten's son, the boy king Tutankhamun, and all his treasures. He was only a minor king, ruling for only 10 years, but think of all the gold in his tomb. Later in this course, we will translate some of the inscriptions on Tutankhamun's treasures. This was a country with incredible wealth. Towards the end of the New Kingdom, we get Pharaoh Ramses the Great. He rules for 67 years and has plenty of time to build. His mortuary temple, called the Ramesseum, is beautiful. And he builds loads of temples up and down the Nile. Perhaps his most famous is Abu Simbel, carved into the rock just past Egypt's southern border. It will play a crucial role in the decipherment of hieroglyphs, as you'll learn in a later lecture. But at this point, we have to ask the question, with all these temples and tombs, with this incredibly stable, powerful nation, how is it possible to lose the ability to read the Egyptian language? Texts are all over the place, on temple walls, on papyri, on coffins. How do you lose a language? The answer lies in Egypt's last 1,000 years of history. Once again, Egypt would collapse, but this time it wouldn't recover its glory. 100 years after Ramses the Great, the priests were becoming very powerful. They had been given large tracts of land by the pharaohs for centuries, and now they were as powerful as the king himself and took control of Egypt. The 21st dynasty was a dynasty of priest kings. But this was not a strong government, and soon Egypt was invaded and ruled by a series of foreign powers. This is what we call the Third Intermediate Period. It's about 1069 BC to 525 BC. There would be Libyans, Nubians, and others. And in the end, even more powerful countries took over. This is the Late Period. This is from 525 BC to 332 BC. Egypt is ruled by superpowers. The brutal Persians invade and destroy temples and tombs. The priests, the literate class, are not supported, and fewer people can read hieroglyphs. Later, it will get even worse for the Egyptian language. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great enters Egypt and expels the Persians. The Persians were so cruel that Alexander is probably viewed as a savior rather than a conqueror of Egypt. Alexander's entry into Egypt begins 300 years of Greek rule. We call this period the Ptolemaic period, from about 305 to 30 BC, because when Alexander dies, his kingdom is divided among his generals, and General Ptolemy gets Egypt. All the subsequent Greek rulers will be named Ptolemy. The queens have only 3 different names. They are either Bernike, from we get our Bernice from that, Arsinoe, or Cleopatra. There were 7 Ptolemaic queens named Cleopatra, and the famous one was the last, Cleopatra VII. As far as we know, she is the only one of the Ptolemies who ever learned to speak Egyptian. And this is the start of how you lose a language. The Ptolemies lived in Alexandria and pretty much never left it. Alexandria was called the city, and all the rest was Egypt. They were still conducting business, collecting taxes, even permitting the priests to build temples, but most transactions were conducted in Greek. If you were a smart young Egyptian man in ancient Egypt during this period, and you wanted to rise in the bureaucracy, then you learned Greek. But still, Egyptians were speaking Egyptian too. So what happened? To some extent, the answer is the Romans. Led by Octavian, the Romans defeat Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium, ending 3 centuries of Greek domination over Egypt. The Romans run Egypt like a business, wanting only to ship the grain back to feed Rome's growing population. The priesthood is not supported, the Egyptian religion declines, temples close, and the ability to read hieroglyphs is being lost. The final blow is Christianity. Christianity enters Egypt in the middle of the 1st century. It's being spread by St. Mark, and it really took hold. In the early 4th century, monasticism began in Egypt, with St. Anthony preaching that asceticism brings one closer to God. Now the caves of Egypt are filled with hermits. Even today, Egypt is home to many monasteries. St. Catherine's, on the Sinai Peninsula, is the longest continuously inhabited building on the planet. With the introduction of Christianity, there's a conscious effort to stamp out the old religion and the use of hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are a pagan script and must not be permitted in the new religion. But what should replace them? Well, the Egyptians had been familiar with the Greek alphabet for 3 centuries. Why not use Greek letters? Now remember, people are still speaking the native Egyptian language. They're just going to write the sounds of their language using Greek letters and a half dozen other new ones to supply sounds that the Greek alphabet didn't have. This is the last form of the ancient Egyptian language, and it's called Coptic, because the Egyptians who converted to Christianity were called Copts. Copt comes from the Greek Egyptios, for Egyptian. which became Gupt, which became Copt. So the Copts are all Egyptians. It's redundant to say the Egyptian Copts. In 391 AD, Emperor Theodosius I closes all non-Christian churches and temples. Just 3 years later, in 394, we have the last known hieroglyphic inscription. It's scratched on a wall at Philae Temple by a scribe in the House of Records of Isis. His name was Esmet Achem, and he probably knew that he was the end of a 3,000-year-old tradition of scribes who read and wrote hieroglyphs. So with the new Christian religion, we have the death of hieroglyphs. For 1,400 years, no one would be able to read them. Recovering a language was a long, slow process that began by figuring out sounds that the hieroglyphs meant. The meaning of those sounds would come later. Right now, we are learning the sounds associated with the hieroglyphs. Let me give you a surprise quiz. I've written a few names of famous people in hieroglyphs. Let's see if you've learned your alphabet and can read them. Sound it out. Remember, don't go by the spelling of the name. We are transliterating. All we care about is the sound. The first name of this person is the first 3 hieroglyphs. It's a bit difficult because we're missing vowels, but still, we can sound it out. The first hieroglyph is the DJ sound, J. Then the mouth, Then the second, J sound, George, George, George. I left out the O because Middle Egyptian doesn't have one. I could have put in an arm hieroglyph, the E, the E. I thought it sounded closer without it, so I left it out. It's a matter of taste. Notice how I grouped the mouth under the serpent? That's how the Egyptians would have done it, because it looks nice. Our second name is easier. We start with the quail chick, which is either a U or a W, right? Could be either one. Then the vulture, Ah. This is followed by our pool, Sh, and a reed, I. Now we have the water sign, N. On top of the jar stand, G, G. Because they're both short hieroglyphs, one's on top of the other. Next, the bread T and the quail chick, U or W, followed by another water sign, Washington, George Washington. I used the quail chick U for the O sound at the end of Washington because I think it approximates the sound pretty well. Let's try another. This one isn't too difficult if you know your alphabet. It's just one name. The foot is the B sound. The vulture is an A. The double reed, a Y. So far we have bay. The loaf is a T. The viper, an F. The arm, an E sound. And last, the water sign is an N. So let's say it aloud and see if we can hear something familiar. Beethoven. Beethoven. Yep, it's Beethoven. I used the viper F because we don't have a V. It was as close as we could get to a V. How about this one? I bet you'll get it quickly. Again, just one name this time. What do you think? Yes, Madonna. The owl is the M, the vulture the A, the hand the D. The name is spelled with two N's, but we only hear one, so we only need one water sign. Finally, we end with an A vulture for the final A. Good. Okay, not bad. Now let's add some vocabulary words to the few we already know. Each day, we'll learn another 10 or so, and before you know it, you'll be scribes. To keep track of the new vocabulary words, I suggest you keep a notebook just for your vocabulary words. This will be your own personal dictionary. Our exercise book has a dictionary, but it's very good practice to make your own. It really helps learning the words. Reserve a page for each letter of the alphabet. You won't need a page for O or L, because the Egyptians didn't have them. As we add a new hieroglyphic word, add it on the appropriate page. We already have a word that begins with owl, right? Our word for in. So that goes on the owl or M page. Let's start with our owl word. The owl is pronounced m, and we usually say m when it's by itself, rather than m. As we've seen, it means in, but it has several other meanings. It could also mean from and out of. So it's an important word. It's a one-letter word, written with just the owl. But when it was pronounced, as in the word for in ancient Egypt, it may have been im, or something else. We just don't know for sure because they didn't write the vowels. Sometimes ancient Egyptian scribes substituted another hieroglyph for the owl. It's a statue base on which a sculpture could rest. If you see it, just think owl. It's an M. We have the other words for our mystery sentence, the sun is shining in the sky. So we can add to our vocabulary list shine, sun, and sky. If we make a slight change to the word for sun, we can have the name of the sun god Re. Just replace the sun determinative with the god determinative, and that's Re, the sun god. I bet you've heard it pronounced Ra. That's fine too. Remember, we aren't sure about the vowels. The god determinative is a seated man wearing a long garment, so his knees are covered by it. The long curved beard tells us he's a god. Let me show you how to draw him, because he's important. We'll see this hieroglyph a lot. Start with the head. Come down to the back, then across, and now we need a curve up and down for the knees. Then up to the head again, add his headdress, and finally the beard. Now you've got a god. The fact that the Egyptians used different words for the sun and for the sun god, Re, shows us something very important about ancient Egyptian religion. They didn't worship the fiery globe in the sky. The sun was associated with a god, but was not the god itself. This is a much more sophisticated position than just worshiping inanimate objects. But now, let's add some more simple words. If you put a reed leaf in front of the owl, it has a slightly different meaning from in. This variant means herein. Because we have a reed before the owl, put this word on the I page of your homemade dictionary. The water hieroglyph is pronounced and means to, but only with regard to persons, as in, I gave it to Alice. If we want to go to a place or do something to a thing, we use the mouth sign. It's pronounced or R, and it means to with regards to places, as in, I went to the city. Remember, because the ancient Egyptians didn't write the vowels, we say or R. It could have been ear, ar, ru, etc. Same with our owl, right, for im and It could have been im, mu, etc. Now, I'll give you your next vocabulary word, and you tell me how it was pronounced. What do you think? That's right, 10. T-N. We put in the short E just to make it easier to say. That's the word for this. It's the feminine form. Easy to remember because almost all feminine words have a T at the end. I know, 10 doesn't have it at the end. It has it at the beginning. It's just an oddity. The word this comes after the word it modifies, like most adjectives in ancient Egypt. So this sky would look like this. We know that sky is feminine because it ends in a T. The sky determinative doesn't have a phonetic value here. So we would say pet 10. Now, the masculine form of this is the rectangular reed mat and the water sign, pronounced pen. Notice how it's written. Because they're both short hieroglyphs, one is on top of the other, just like 10. So the two demonstrative adjectives for this go after the nouns. This is usual. Almost all adjectives follow their nouns. Let's look at a pair of adjectives that's the exception to the rule. Now, pronounce it for me. Yep, key. The basket is the K, and the double reed leaf, the Y. We put the short E to get key. That's how it's pronounced. It means another. This is the masculine form, and unlike most other adjectives, it goes before the noun. The feminine form is ket, which makes sense. It's feminine, and it ends in a T. So, how would you write another sky? First, you have to think about our word for sky. It's feminine, it ends in a T, so we need the feminine form of another, which is ket. Now we have to remember that another goes before the noun, so another sky would be ket pet. Let's just add two more words to our vocabulary. How would you pronounce this? Yes, boo. The foot is the B, and the chick is the U or W. The word means place. Not the verb to place, but the noun, meaning a location. One last word for today. I know this is a lot. How's it pronounced? Chet, that's right. And it means thing. Now for next time, practice writing these words as you enter them in your dictionary. Creating your own dictionary will improve your handwriting and also help you to learn the words. When you enter the words in your dictionary, also indicate how they sounded. Transliteration is important because it helps us remember the vocabulary words. If we didn't attempt to reconstruct how the words sounded, all we would have is visual memory, how the words look. The transliteration adds a second dimension to how we can remember our words. There are several ways we can indicate pronunciation of our words. Linguists use the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is basically our Latin letters with a few extra symbols. For our course, we don't use that. We will approximate the sounds with our alphabet. But even here, we have choices. For example, let's look at the word for sky. We know the vowels were not written, and at the end of the word is a determinative that was not pronounced. So we're left with pit, pt. One option is to leave it just like that. So in our dictionary, after the written word, we could put in parentheses pet, pt, to indicate what we know about it. But I think there's a better option. As I mentioned before, there's a convention when vocalizing the words to insert a short E between consonants when we don't know the missing vowels. This makes it easier to say. So pit becomes pet. Easier to say, and I think easier to remember. So let's go with that option. So in our dictionaries, on the P page, our entry for sky would look something like this. We'd have pet, the sound, and then the definition. In the cases where we have an idea from the Coptic of what the missing vowels were, we'll use that. We can always go with the best bet. One last thing. With a word like chet, thing, because we transliterate it with a K, we can put it on our K page of our dictionary. Okay, I have one last minor additional homework assignment for you. Translate the phrase to another place, to another place. I'll see you next time.